Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Bennett Institute webinar. We have a fascinating event for you, and I hope it's a good opportunity to take a break from doom scrolling or 24-hour news watching or whatever else is going on in your working lives this morning. My name's Diane Coyle. I'm co-director of the Bennett Institute here at the University of Cambridge. And it's a real pleasure and honour to welcome two brilliant speakers we have in conversation this morning. We're going to hear first from Lord David Sainsbury, who is Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, but particularly relevant this morning, he's a former science minister, long-standing interest in science and innovation policy, and also author of, this is probably reversed on the screen, with this really interesting new book, Windows of Opportunity, How Nations Create Wealth. And so he will talk to us first for about 20 minutes about some of the ideas in that book, informed by his long experience of these issues. He's then going to be in conversation with Professor Bart van Ark, who is Professor of Productivity Studies at the University of Manchester and the director of the new ESRC-funded Productivity Institute. He's also one of the gurus of comparative productivity studies over a very long period. So we've got two amazing speakers. After that, in conversation, we will come to the questions. So I'd like all of you to put your questions in the Q&A panel as they occur to you throughout this morning. And I'm then going to pick some of those and relay them to the speakers to answer a bit later on. There's also a Twitter hashtag. It's hashtag BI for Bennett Institute, BI Productivity Puzzle. And so with that, I'm going to hand straight over to David Sainsbury. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diane. I'm going to talk about the issue of innovation, competitive advantage, and the productivity puzzle. In the period between 2010 and 2019, the UK had a very poor record of economic growth, with the annualized rate of growth of output per hour averaging just 0.4%. And the pandemic, of course, has made the situation much worse. The economists who advise the government have not, however, been able to explain why our rate of growth has been so low, referring to it as a productivity puzzle, which is why I assume the government has put £34 million into a productivity institute to try to find out why the UK has a low rate of economic growth. An obvious first question is why the economists who advise the government can't explain our low rate of growth. The answer is they can't, because most of them are neoclassical economists whose thinking about economic growth is based on a mathematical model of growth, which has built into it three assumptions which are completely unrealistic. They are that the capabilities of firms don't matter, and that we can think in terms of the representative firm, that firms are managed by rational managers, and that consequently entrepreneurs play no part, and that we're dealing with perfectly competitive markets where everyone is selling the same product or service at the same price. Now, in such a world, the only variable left is the overall efficiency of the market, and the performance of firms is not a variable which can be used to explain the economic growth of countries. I think in these circumstances, we need, I believe, a new theory of economic growth. And in my book, Windows of Opportunity, How Nations Create Wealth, I've put forward what I have called a production capability theory of growth. This, I think, can, at a very high level, explain why the UK has had a slow rate of growth and why we have major regional inequalities, as well as suggesting the areas where we need new policies to improve the UK's performance. Before I describe the production capability theory of economic growth and show how it can be used to explain the UK's poor rate of growth, there's one technical issue which it's important to understand. When economists talk about the productivity of the economy, they're not talking about production efficiency, as most people think. They're not talking about the number of man hours used to produce the economy's output. What they're talking about is the value added per capita of firms in the economy, inflation adjusted. This is important because the value added per capita of a firm depends not only on its production efficiency, but also its innovation and competitive advantage in the marketplace and the price it can charge its customers. This point is central to the production capability theory of economic growth, which I set out in my book. And if we look at the following chart, we can see that value added per capita varies between sectors, and the UK's poor growth rate over the period covered by the chart can be explained by what happened in the different sectors of the economy and the shift of economic activity between them. What the chart shows is the changes in value added per capita of the different major sectors of the economy over the period 2010 to 2019. And what we see is that the slow growth rate was due to the performance of three major sectors of the economy: manufacturing, financial services, and oil and gas, and a shift in economic activity from high value added sectors to low value added sectors, as shown by a negative between effect of -2.4%. In the case of manufacturing, it suffered a fall in GVA from £55.73 to £52.20, and also saw a fall in its percentage share of total GVA from 10.64% to 9.65%. This was caused by firms in foreign countries rapidly innovating and increasing the competitive advantage of their manufacturing industries faster than our manufacturing industries were doing. In the case of financial services, which is one of the UK's high value added services, the GVA per hour grew by 3.45% between 2010 and 2019. But as a percentage of the country's total GVA, it fell from 5.44% to 3.99%. The average revenues of the leading listed 4 UK banks fell by 17% between 2010 and 2019, as lower aggregate demand in the economy resulted in less demand for financial products. In addition, many of the financial products which had flourished in the boom conditions leading up to the financial crash were seen to have little economic value after the crash. Finally, the oil and gas sector saw a fall in GVA per hour from a massive £681 per hour to £546 per hour, while its percentage share of the country's GVA fell from 1.51% to 0.72%. The latter figure was due to a fall in GVA per hour and a fall in output by a quarter from the end of 2010 to the end of 2019. This obviously had a significant impact on the growth rate of the UK. And I think it's surprising, in view of its importance to the national growth figures, that so little attention has been paid by economists to the impact of North Sea oil. In summary, the reason we have had a slow rate of productivity growth in the UK is because of the global competition in high value added per sector sectors of our economy, they are today a smaller share of our economy than in 2000. And the only way we can improve our rate of growth is by increasing the number and innovation and competitive advantage of firms in the high value added sectors of our economy. The production capability theory of economic growth can also be used to explain the substantial regional inequalities we have in the UK. As work at the centre of cities has shown, this divide is not simply due to geography. It's not due to workers in the north working less hard than in the south or being less efficient. Nor is it the case that all cities in the north are less prosperous than those in the south. It is, on the contrary, due to the fact that only a few cities in the north, which benefited from incubating the major industries of the Industrial Revolution, have been able, in the face of fierce foreign competition, to reinvent themselves and move into today's high value-added per capita sectors. Government policies in the past, which have explicitly attempted to reduce the north-south divide, and which can be traced back to the 1930s, have not been effective because the majority of the interventions have tended to reinforce the existing industrial structure by supporting low-knowledge routine activities to reduce unemployment, as opposed to supporting the reinvention of cities by increasing the number of knowledge-intensive businesses in them. As a result, in many cities in the north, jobs in declining industries have been replaced by low-skilled routine jobs, which are vulnerable to foreign competition and technological change. Cotton mills and dockyards have been replaced by call centers and distribution sheds. What we need to do now, urgently, is to create more high value added per capita firms and jobs in the role of that DARPA plays in the USA is well understood. Also, the UK's programme for diffusing the new techniques of Industry 4 to companies is extremely poor compared to the programmes of other countries. In the area of executive remuneration and the linking of it in recent years to shareholder value, I think it's been disastrous. Encouraging executives to focus on the short-term profitability of their businesses rather than innovation and the long-term creation of competitive advantage. It has also incentivized executives to use the cash generated by their businesses to buy back shares to keep up the share price of their companies rather than invest in innovation. New ways of remunerating executives need to be found if we want to increase the innovative performance of UK companies. As far as levelling up in the lower income regions of the country is concerned, if we want to see more high value added companies set up and flourish in the lower income regions of the country, the government will need to devolve more powers in the area of skills and transport to the mayoral combined authorities, and also increase and improve the Strength in Places Fund, so that it can support the growth of more high value added clusters and jobs in the lower income regions of the country. Finally, I'd like to point out that if one thinks that the production capability theory of economic growth that I've described is more realistic than the neoclassical one, it suggests a number of pieces of research, which I don't think the Institute for Productivity is currently planning to do, but which I think would be valuable to the government as it develops policies to increase the country's rate of growth. These are, firstly, why some cities have been able to reinvent themselves better than others. Why, for example, has Boston in America been able to reinvent itself again and again? Secondly, what are the most effective institutions that other countries have developed to diffuse innovation to their firms? I'm thinking of organizations such as ITRI in Taiwan, Manufacturing Extension Partnerships in America, and the Fraunhofer Society in Germany. Thirdly, what can governments do to improve the innovative performance of firms in terms of governance, remuneration, and management skills? There is some knowledge about these issues scattered around in the academic literature, but if we think that innovation is the engine of economic growth, as I do, and if we're going to significantly improve the innovative performance of UK firms, we will need to do some new thinking on these key issues.
Good morning, my name is Bart van Ark, and first of all, my thanks to the Bennett Institute for Public Policy for being able to join this conversation with Lord Sainsbury, and thank you, Lord Sainsbury, for your remarks this morning, but also for writing this excellent book, which I really enjoyed reading in the past couple of weeks. So I'm very honored to have this conversation with you. Heading a new productivity institute that you referred to a little earlier, pooling all forces together from academia, but also from policy and business to tackle this productivity puzzle is a big challenge. And I think your book has a lot of really good advice and recommendations. So including some of the remarks that you made this morning. So I'll take them all to heart and hope that we can even discuss some of those during our conversation this morning. I think you're spot on the key aspects of the productivity puzzle, which actually as a result becomes a little bit less of a puzzle. But I also think you make very important remarks on the potential solutions. It's an ambitious plan, and the path towards a solution, I think, is full of hurdles. And to some extent, I want to talk a little bit with you about how we get rid of some of these hurdles towards getting this productivity puzzle resolved. The three things that I'd like to pursue in our discussion this morning in the next 15 minutes or so. First, I'd like to talk with you a little bit more about your concept of productivity, which really is driven by this concept of competitive advantage, driven by innovation, and how we should think about it, and what also are the potential sort of negative side effects that we need to avoid from focusing on competitive advantage. Second, I'd like to talk to you about to what extent the productivity puzzle is the result of underinvestment in many sources of growth versus misallocation of those resources or inefficient usage of those resources. And then finally, I'd like to, as I said, talk a little bit about your policy recommendations, in particular the path towards building these systems of innovation that you are emphasizing so strongly. So let's start with the thinking about productivity. It's a word thrown around a lot, and there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of different usages across business policy and academia and a welfare perspective. And I think you're making a very important point to say that productivity quite often tends to be equated with productivity efficiency. So essentially productivity is about how many widgets per worker you make, if you use the sort of classical literature in this respect. Whereas at a national level, when we look at the numbers that are being produced by the Office of National Statistics, it's a different concept. It's really value added, adjusted for inflation. And that involves a lot of other things than just productivity efficiency. And you bring in this concept of competitive advantage of being an important driver here. I think that's a really powerful point. But in your book, you also quote an important economic historian, Moses Abramovich, who back in the 1950s already said that when you look at productivity, there's this idea of the widgets and there's this idea of capital and investment, but the rest, which economists sometimes call total factor productivity, he said essentially is a measure of our ignorance. And even today, 60, 70 years later, I think to a large extent, it's still a measure of our ignorance. And I think you're trying to fill and reduce our ignorance by actually focusing on this competitive advantage concept. But there's probably a lot more. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about sort of the potential side effects that competitive advantage can have. Competitive advantage can lead to some companies doing much better than others. Therefore, it can lead to more market concentration. And in a way that's good for productivity because that creates scale, and scale is very important for productivity growth. But concentration also creates market power, and it can create rents or sometimes super profits, if you want to use the Marxian concept, which is sort of profitability beyond the normal profit that you need to compensate your shareholders who provide the capital for you to invest and your workers who provide the labor. So that potentially can also threaten new investment. Competitive advantage can lead to concentration, and that concentration can lead to companies not making the investments they should make to drive productivity. So it's really about dynamic competitive advantage. And there is a bit of literature now, certainly in the US. Thomas Philippon has been written an important book saying that actually market concentration in the United States has increased quite a bit in recent years. And he is indicating that that is a potential real threat for productivity growth. So first question I want to ask you really is, how can we make sure that competitive advantage becomes dynamic competitive advantage and raises competitive intensity and doesn't end up with incumbents who are taking larger and larger shares of the economy and ultimately could be a cause of the problem rather than the solution?
Yeah, I think there is always that issue. Of course, the major way you can prevent that is by having a large number of companies who are trying to get competitive advantage. Because the whole point about competitive advantage is that it doesn't last forever. As soon as someone gains competitive advantage, it's then open to other countries, other companies to copy that innovation and reduce the competitive advantage the company has. So if the economy is working effectively and you've got lots of innovating companies, then that isn't a problem. Of course, there is always a case where, as I think we've seen with some of the big high-tech firms in America, they do get, because they have platform technologies, they do get a position which is anti-competitive in that sense. It's monopoly. And there you have to take action to try and reduce those monopolies. But I don't think that is a reason for stop trying to have firms get competitive advantage. And actually, one of the more ridiculous things I think about some economic thinking today is that they think that competitive advantage is sort of some kind of monopoly power. And they start talking about rent seeking and all those things as if that's a very bad thing. Of course, it isn't. It's a very good thing that people get competitive advantage, because that means they're giving more benefit to their customers.
Yeah, no, I agree. And as I said, I think it's really about a policy to make sure that new firms can continue to enter and have a chance to compete. And I think you point on platform economics that's becoming not just affecting the tech firms, but increasingly other sectors in the economy as well, is something that I think from a public policy perspective, we should really take care of to make sure that we keep having this dynamic competitive advantage. The other part of this is not just the reward for capital, but the reward for labor. Over the last decades, we have seen a sustained decline in the share of labor income in national income. And some people, or many scholars would say this is partly the result of all the new technology, which to some extent has reduced all jobs, but not created and generated enough new jobs. Partly it's the result of lower wages. So that's an important issue also for us in the Productivity Institute, because productivity ultimately has to be about people making a better living, having productive jobs on which they have better wages, and therefore increase the distribution of the benefits from productivity. How can you, in your mind, is the concept of competitive advantage trying us to help to turn around this decline in the labor income share, which in the long term will be very detrimental for the economy?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very fundamental issue. It's, I think, almost universally true that high value added companies also pay high wages. And actually, the main reason for the low wages in our economy is because, and I perhaps ought to have stressed this more in my remarks, what we've done in recent years in this country, and also has happened in America, is that we've kept unemployment down by creating masses of low value added jobs. We haven't increased our high value added jobs. We've created masses of low value added jobs, typically in the gig economy. So the gig economy almost all is in businesses, which is very difficult to create competitive advantage, have low value added, and pay low wages. And that is, I think, the most significant reason why we've had these low wage, more and more low wage people. It's because we have more low wage type businesses, low value added businesses. So the way to get out of that is to create more high value added businesses, which, as I say, almost universally pay higher wages.
But still, I agree with that point, but still, even when you look at your chart of the high value added industries, which obviously in the UK have a lower share compared to the OECD average. That's true for manufacturing, but even if you take finance aside, even true for some of the knowledge-intensive business services. But even if we would have a policy that would really drive an increase in those kind of activities, it's unlikely, even in the successful East Asian countries, that this would go far beyond, say, 25% of GDP. Now, that would be progress compared to where we are today. Certainly when you include knowledge and business services is probably even a little bit more. But there's still a very large part of the economy that is non-tradable, that is providing the kind of services that we're using every day. There we also need to see productivity increase and wage increases. So how do we create competitive advantage in those industries that are a very large part of our economy?
Well, in terms of competitive advantage, the answer is very difficult. Many of those jobs play a very important role in the economy, but it's very difficult to get competitive advantage if you're a hairdresser or small retailer or news agent. It is very difficult, and I think you're not going to see high wages in a market economy from those areas, and you have to take a decision which is about minimum wages. That used to be said was something that destroy those jobs. I think that's now disappeared, and you have to say, look, in our society, there are minimum wages, minimum income, and we will put that at a level which will give people a decent wage, or wage they can live on. Mm-hmm. I think that's the answer to that. I don't think there is a way that you can make them enormously more profitable.
So does that mean that even if we're successful in the policies that you're proposing, that we can make 25% of the economy more productive, and the other 75% of the economy is as low productive as it is, and we're essentially subsidizing it, if I may use that word, from the high productivity sectors of the economy? So do we get a more dual economy with a very high productivity sector, but a lot of low productivity activities that we never can make more productive?
Well, I think it's not that we will go that route. It is that's where we are.
Right.
It's pretty much where we've been in the past. So I think the question is, do you try and create more high value added businesses, and particularly those in areas like manufacturing, which have a high value added, and actually give many kind of middle level jobs, which are well paid. I think it's the loss of those kind of middle range manufacturing jobs that has been one of the problems, and the replacement by lots of low value added gig type of jobs. But of course, the other thing is we've got to tackle the whole question of 0 hours businesses and so on, because that's the real scandal. And we've got to say that those sort of contracts, which are really a throwback to the Victorian era of, people lining up outside a dockyard and being selected for work each day, we've got to give those people a security. That will mean that those kind of services will have to charge more, because they're going to have to pay people more and on a proper basis, and that will I think cause there be less of those jobs, which is not a problem if you can replace them with more high value added jobs.
I'd like to go on with the second issue I'd like to discuss with you, and that's the issue of underinvestment versus inefficient allocation. So I much appreciate your thinking about investment in the broad sense of the word. This is not about machinery and equipment only, or even infrastructure, but it's much more broadly about the sources of innovation: human capital, knowledge capital, sources of organizational capital. And this, for us in the Productivity Institute, are very important sources of growth. And our view is that that's been really one of the reasons why we do have this problem in the UK being bigger than elsewhere, is there's been chronic underinvestment in many of those resources for a very long time. But you could argue that there's also a certain extent of a risk of misallocation. Once you start investing, you also want to make sure that you invested in those areas, to our earlier discussion about high value added industries and low value added industries, that it really goes to the high value added industries, and that we're not throwing it at low value added activities that are not creating us the kind of competitive advantage that we really need. So for that, we need some thinking about how do we make sure this is efficient. And you're very critical of the neoclassical approach to market efficiency. But I would want to challenge you a little bit on this and say, well, just throwing a lot of money at it, we need a mechanism in order to make sure that it goes to those activities that are indeed creating the high value added. And if markets are not going to do it, there are other forces that need to do this. So I'd like you to talk a little bit more about how can we make sure that we use our scarce resources, and to the extent that it is government funding, our taxpayer money, well, in order to generate that competitive advantage.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely basic to the approach I'm taking is that government has a role to play in making certain that particular areas are properly funded, and making certain that resources are allocated to those areas to increase productivity. Just take the areas I mentioned. I mean, one of the big scandals in this country has been the area of technical education. And the problem there is partly we've never had a proper system of technical education. We've never had a national system of qualifications which everyone understands. So that's something which the government now, I'm glad to say, has focused on. But also there is just a question of putting money into that area, which we haven't done. I mean, if you look at the funding of FE colleges, I mean, it's been scandalously going down. Now that is a case where not only is it vital for productivity and industry, but it's also a case where we will create, if we do it right, lots of new, not a hugely high value, but a lot of good, solid, middle-range jobs. And it's the lack of those jobs which has been both bad for industry and, of course, has meant that people have not been able to have those profitable jobs. I mean, when I last looked at this figure, which was time ago, and it probably got worse since then, we were short of hundreds of thousands, well, 200,000 or more jobs in technicians required in industry. And we had 400,000 young people unemployed. Now, it's just inconceivable that there aren't lots of those youngsters who could do good technical jobs needed by industry. And it's an utter failure of our system of education that they haven't had the skills training to do that. And if we do that, not only does it increase our wealth as a society, but it also provides these mid-range type jobs which give people a solid basis of living standards. And I think this applies to a lot of the other areas as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A lot of your arguments remind me of this raging debate in the 1990s of the East Asian miracle, and you're referring to some of that in your book. I think you have a whole chapter about catching up countries. So there was this debate at that time how these East Asian countries like South Korea and Taiwan could actually grow so rapidly. And a lot was about that the Washington consensus about that, markets had to do this, had to be replaced by this collaboration between business and policy and the education sector, to the very important description of the technical education. Somehow we've never really been able to do this in the Western economies, and certainly, as you say, we haven't been able to do it very well in the case of the UK, which really drives me to the final point on the path towards getting there. You're putting a lot of emphasis on this importance of national innovation systems, sectoral innovation systems, regional innovation systems, and they really are dependent on collaboration between the various parts in the economy. And that really is something that's incredibly difficult to do. I've come back to the UK relatively recently, and I've been mainly looking at it from outside in. most of the time you see that countries are actually failing to build these national innovation systems because they don't have the initiatives, they don't have an understanding of it. What I find interesting in the UK is that there's actually no shortage of initiatives or of understanding of what is needed. I mean, there are plenty of initiatives, public and private, across regions, at different levels of government. But somehow it feels very fragmented, lack of coordination, lack of learning from each other, lack of scaling up, which again, as I said earlier, is so important in creating productivity and competitive advantage. So I don't think there's a shortage of intellectual brain power on how to do it. But there seems to be a big failure for us to build this kind of collaboration that is needed in order to build these innovation systems. So that seems to me a huge hurdle on the path towards where you want to go. Now, you've been in government for many years. I'm sure you've tried to tackle this. And I'd really like to try and understand this really deep problem of really a national governance problem on how we can build these kind of innovation systems in order to get to the goal where you think we should go as a country.
I think probably I disagree quite a lot with you on that, because
Okay.
I think quite a big part of the problem is actually the poor quality of policy making, and particularly the prevalence of these neoclassical ideas that you just leave everything to the market. And let me take the example I know best, which is technical education, which I've been interested in all my life. And I mean, it's the most appalling story. The first report which said our technical education system was not as good as the Germans was in 1870. And since then, we have had endless reports saying what should happen. And these have been tried, and they're usually based on an absolute total ignorance of what other countries do and what we can learn from other countries. And we put them in, they're half thought through, they don't work, and then we stop them after 5 years and have the next one. I mean, just to give you a scale of this, I think in the last 35 years, we've had 28 pieces of legislation on FE colleges, on FE education in our country. And up to a few years ago, the position was quite as bad as it's ever been. Now, technical education should not be a subject, it's not a subject where there is great political divide. Everyone realizes this is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
This is a good thing both in social terms and productivity terms. But we, in our way of not really looking into what makes a good technical education system, as opposed to one group saying it all must be, the other group saying the state must have nothing to do with it. No one bothering actually to look at how people do it well. We've managed to get through and have a very bad technical education system. Now, as I say, I hope we've changed that because I was lucky enough to be able to chair a committee to review this. What we did was to look at what other countries have done and see what we could learn from them. And I think as a result of that, we actually have some proper policies. So all that's a way of saying, I think it's not a question of goodwill. It's not a question of, it's a question we just don't do the policy making very well, because we always think we have unique problems and there has to be a unique British solution. Whereas actually the reality is, other than perhaps fox hunting, we do not have any different problem from other countries. Almost every other country has exactly these problems, and you can learn from them by actually going and having a look and finding out how you can do it well.
So inherently, that is a national governance problem, right? Why are we not learning enough from what other nations are doing? I think again, I don't think there's a shortage of comparisons about why the UK is behind Germany in some of those respects, or even behind the US. But the national governance problem is really that we seem to struggle to implement these learnings.
But when did you last hear a government minister say, we don't know how to deal with this, and actually we're going to see if we can learn from other countries. But if you talk to a senior Singapore minister, and they have done incredibly well in terms of productivity, economic growth, almost the first thing they will say to you is we want to learn from what other people do and find out what is the best way to do it. And when did you last hear a minister of either political party say that?
Great. Diane, I'm going to hand over to you to invite some questions from the audience to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much, Bart. And perhaps the team can turn my video back on for me. And here we go. So that's a fascinating conversation, and we've got a lot of questions in already, not surprisingly. So I'm going to try to cluster these and also ask both of you for your comments on them. And the first two I want is that we're thinking about. So we had one question from William Broad, who I think might be based in China, which is about the way that China has grown through great cities. And should we be thinking about focusing on the growth of big cities in the UK and not worrying so much about levelling up surrounding areas, small towns or countryside? And on the other hand, a question from Michel Marchaline at the OECD about rural productivity, and should we not be paying attention to high value activities and increasing rural productivity? So I think the broader question behind both of those is, what's the right kind of geography to be thinking about if you want to improve productivity performance? So perhaps we'll go to you first, Lord Sainsbury, and then to you next, Professor Van Ark.
I think the answer is you have to put a lot of weight onto cities, and the reason for that is if you want to get high-tech businesses growing in a particular place, they usually need to be able to draw on quite a large catchment area to get the high-tech workers that they need. So you tend to find that they gravitate towards cities, and the way you help towns is by making certain that they're linked as well towards the cities, so that they can provide people to work in the cities or to provide the smaller businesses which support the new high-tech businesses in the cities. So I think as a whole, trying to get a lot of this high-tech business in towns is probably not the way to do it. It's to focus it, and particularly in this country, because if we're going to devolve powers to enable people to do more support to industry, I think the only basis you could do that on, and I think it's very important we do it, is on mayoral combined authorities. I think that's a real opportunity we have to do some devolution in areas like transport and skills. Trying to do that to cities, they as a whole do not have the capability of managing that. So that's the answer on the question of cities. As far as rural productivity is concerned, yeah, I think this is also an issue where we've actually, I think, gone backwards. We used to be much better at this. We used to have something called AMBS, which was a way of diffusing knowledge on agriculture to farmers. And that was a huge success. And if you go back to pre-Thatcherite days, we had world-class productivity in agriculture. AMBS was then abolished, and we are falling down from having a position of world-class productivity. So this is a case where we just want to learn from our past and realize that you need to have mechanisms to do this. There is actually a body which is doing this quite successfully. It's a market-driven initiative called Agritech, which is doing this and trying to get more high-tech methods into agriculture. I think this is very important, and we should be doing this more generally across the country.
Thank you.
So I'd say that first of all, cities are critical to the productivity. So there's no doubt about it. But there's some uniqueness about the UK issue. Philip McCann from Sheffield, who's a leading theme leader in the Productivity Institute, has been writing extensively about the fact that apart from a few cities outside the 3 or 4 core cities in the UK, cities also struggle in the UK, and that's pretty unique compared to other countries. So it's not just a matter of cities versus rural, but it's regions, low productivity regions versus high productivity regions. So I do think we have a specific UK problem, and I think the whole leveling up agenda needs to be thought through from how do we make sure, how do these regions as a whole benefit and not just the cities. On the rural productivity, it goes back to some of the earlier discussion I had with Lord Sainsbury. I strongly believe that outside the high value added sectors, we need to think about the rest of the economy very, very hard. And I think there is productivity potential. And I think that's certainly true for rural. It's certainly true for services, particularly with new technologies. There's a lot of opportunity there. And because it's such a large part of the economy, which is not going to go away, I think we have to really spend significant time of our effort to also think about how to level up sort of these low value added industries in addition to the high value added. You can't do everything, but because it's such an important part of the economy, I do think there is scope for these low value added industries as well. By the way, rural productivity, being from the Netherlands myself, can be an incredibly high value added activity, depending on the type of activities that you're undertaking.
Thank you. So there's another cluster of questions coming in about finance. One asking whether the failure of banks in the UK to invest is because they're over-regulated, they've become too risk-averse, perhaps for regulatory reasons. And a related question about why they are not investing in what appear to be potentially very high return frontier activities, and what is it that accounts for that? And I think, you know, this is a long-standing question about the UK. Is there a financing gap? So perhaps we go in the same order, answering those questions about the importance of finance.
I think clearly finance plays a key role in this. The argument that it's because of over-regulation that they're risk averse, I don't buy at all. They're not over-regulated, and when you look at how some parts of it have operated, particularly the situation which we had in the financial crash, any idea that a way forward on this is to reduce regulation, I think is wrong. It should also be said, we have quite a good venture capital industry, and that's a key part of this. So I actually have to say, I think as a whole, the problem is lies within business rather than the question of access to funds. I mean, if people have good businesses, then I don't think it's difficult to get the funding for it. That's not to say that I think finance plays the role that it should play in terms of the governance of companies, because of the way what's happened in financial markets. Really, financial markets play no role in terms of the governance of companies, and that, of course, is a break with really what we think to be the proper capitalist system. I mean, the basic capitalist system is that you have long-term shareholders who make certain that their money is invested well. Of course, that whole idea of the long-term individual shareholder has completely disappeared. And most of the money is now being invested from things like pension funds through investment companies. And we've managed to have a whole set of perverse incentives so that they're really not interested in the governance of companies and take this very short-term view. So, you know, we have now high frequency traders, for example, and these are large amounts of money And you're lucky if those funds are invested in a company for 3 days, let alone 3 years or 30 years. And you have momentum funders and other kind of funders. And it's all about really wealth extraction rather than wealth creation. So I think there are some real problems of our financial system. And the main one being that actually they play very little role now in the proper governance and getting a long-term view from the executives in the companies. And this, of course, as I said, has been compounded by this whole move towards linking people's rewards, executive rewards, to shareholder value, which is operated in completely the reverse way in which it was supposed to operate.
Yeah, I would not want to add a lot to this because I think these are very important points. Maybe 2 small points. First of all, one issue of the finance sector, productivity itself, to me is still a big puzzle. It was a huge driver at a sort of in the macroeconomic statistics of productivity growth before the financial crisis, and then it became a huge detractor afterwards. And I still believe that we are not quite properly capturing what the added value, or the value added, if you like, of the finance industry really is, and how to measure this. So I think there is a big measurement issue here that will help us. It's not just for the sake of measurement, but it will help us to understand how the finance sector contributes to the economy. On the more sort of substantive point on to what extent finance is playing a role in the productivity puzzle, I agree with a lot of what Lord Sainsbury is saying. The only thing I would add is that, you know, given the changing demographics of firms, a lot of smaller firms that starting these platforms, these are not all Amazons. A lot of these are small companies that are using platforms that combine labor and limited amounts of capital in order to start up a company. I'm not sure, you know, the access to the finance is relatively easy, but it ultimately comes to the terms on the basis of which you can use this finance to build a company. And it's a very different way of a company than the traditional brick and mortar company. So I'm not sure if I think it at least deserves a lot more thinking whether the finance sector is really sufficiently equipped to support the development of the platform economy in the broad sense of its word.
We have a lot of questions coming in, which is great. There's some really interesting ones. I'm going to continue trying to cluster them so we can get through the issues. And there's a number of questions about education in different ways. One is about whether we need to focus on management skills at least as much as mid-level technical education, and how to do that, and how to encourage entrepreneurship. And a related point about have we focused too much on higher education, on universities, and then perhaps a related one about linked to the management point about how do you actually tackle this executive pay challenge, and what measures could the government introduce to stop this merry-go-round of ever higher executive pay. So that's a cluster of 3 somewhat related issues. And maybe we'll go the other way this time, and let me turn to you first, Bart.
I will yield most of my time to Lord Sainsbury because he's the real expert, and I know he has so many interesting things to say about it. Let me just say one thing. I worked in the UK at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research back in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. And we were focused, I worked for a group of Sig Price at the National Institute, and obviously he was incredibly focused on the importance of vocational education. So I did a lot of work around that, learned a lot from him at that time. So again, this was, I'm sort of, you know, giving away my age now, but this was almost 40 years ago. You know, the issues that we were talking about, the importance of vocational education, and the emphasis we at that time put on what we could learn from Germany or even France or the Netherlands, these issues still seem to be there. So, and again, it's not an entirely UK problem. I see it in other countries as well, but I think the underappreciation of vocational skills, but also the thinking around how rapidly these skills are changing and having a flexible education system that can deal with these changes. And you do that through having the education system work with the business community, to me is incredibly important. So that's my most important thing that I would bring to discussion, is the importance of vocational education, which is still critically there. But as I said, the rest of my time, I will yield to Lord Sainsbury on this.
Okay, thank
you. Well, I was delighted you worked with Sig Price, because he's one of my heroes. And I thought the studies he did comparing companies abroad with the British companies in terms of productivity and efficiency, and showing how quite a lot of this was related to actually poor technician skills in terms of maintaining machines and whatnot, was really one of the most interesting bits of research in this whole area. Yeah, we have to improve our technical education system. As I say, there are quite clear lessons about how one does this. And just to make the point again, it is about having proper national system of qualifications, which everyone understands and which works in the marketplace. Because if you don't have a national system of qualifications and a young person can't go to an employer and say qualification and know that the employer will know what that work is worth, and therefore will employ him rather than the person who hasn't got the qualifications, the whole system breaks down. And we've never got that right. And I hope we're getting it right now. And I do think there is an issue of trying to rebalance it, the higher education system and the technical route. This idea that 50% is what you need to have people doing graduate work, I think is probably is wrong. Actually, probably 40% is much closer to what we need, and we need to have more people going down the technical education route. I think those are two things I want to make. There is a point also about management skills, which is perhaps a slightly different one, which is, I think our problem has been in this country, we've thought of it as there are people who do technical jobs, and are engineers and scientists. And then there's another group of people who get management skills. I think this is a great mistake. What you need is many more people who have both the technical knowledge and some basic management skills, because the people you want running your businesses, above all, are people who understand the technology of their business, as well as have management skills. Because, to my view, success in running businesses stems from really knowing two things. One is the technology of your business and where it's going, and the second is knowing your customers. And we have too many people who are kind of general managers, and we think they can run every kind of business. And actually, I think if you look back, that's not a route for success.
We've got about 2 minutes left and many more questions, so I'm not going to get to all of them, but we will save the questions to pass on to the panelists later. The final one, and for brief answers, please, is what about the role of demand in all of this? We've been very focused on the production side and innovation. Isn't the problem that demand is weak, and actually where it has been growing, it's been growing for low value-added activities, such as retail or social care? So perhaps one sentence each. Well,
we should just remind ourselves we live in a global economy and there's global demand. And one of the things we've got to do is make our firms more competitive so they can take advantage of global demand as well as our national demand.
Yeah, there's no doubt that weak demand in the past decade has played a role in slowing productivity growth, but it's an evergreen problem in economics to distinguish and disentangle supply and demand, because ultimately they work on each other. So I think, to me, it's critical about creating this high value added economy that sort of generates its demand, and the demand will then create this sort of dynamic competitive advantage that we were talking about before.
Thank you both so much. There are lots of areas I've not got to. People have been raising questions about competition, about the environment, about climate change. So we could obviously continue this conversation for much longer, but we are about to run out of time. Please carry on Twitter with the hashtag BI Productivity Puzzle. But I now want to thank our guest speakers, Lord David Sainsbury, Professor Bart van Ark, for sharing their thoughts this morning. And thanks to you in the audience for a terrific set of questions. And I wish we had a lot more time for it. So to find out more about the Productivity Institute, you can look at the web pages on the Alliance Manchester Business School website. And I'm also delighted to be one of the theme leaders in the Productivity Institute. So watch this space. There'll be some very exciting work coming up over the next years. A reminder that this is a terrific book and you should all go away and read it. And as I'm a former competition regulator myself and all in favour of competition, there's now a competitor to Amazon just launched this week called bookshop.org, which is pooling the resources of independent bookstores. So now you have a choice if you want to order online. To find out more about the Bennett Institute, please look at our website and follow us on Twitter. And as a final sentence, we have a Bennett Prospect Prize, essay prize for early career researchers and policy professionals. This year's question, is it possible to govern well in the age of populism? The prize is £10,000 and you get published by us and by Prospect, so well worth entering. Please look at the website for more information. And thank you all very much. We look forward to welcoming you all to more events in future. Bye.